Yes, we are on now. Good afternoon, all of you. Afternoon session of the day 4 of the Science Leadership Workshop organized by Central University of Punjab in collaboration with 3 science academies and INEAS. Today with us, our esteemed guest, Professor Magdalena Skipper. Professor Skipper has got PhD from MRC University of Cambridge, one of the well-respected, reputed, Ivy League institutes in the world with lots of Nobel Prize winners. She has been working as editor-in-chief of the renowned British journal Nature. And friends, she is the first female editor-in-chief of the Nature's nearly 150 years of the history, as well as the first to come from the life sciences background. And this is an interesting aspect because women in science is one of the themes that has been featured throughout in our science leadership workshop. And she is an inspiring, leader especially for the women in the world. And she's a member of the University of Oxford Center for Personalized Medicine, and the list is endless. A lot of achievement and awards. And Professor Skipper, I met her last time in, this is a World Science Forum meeting in Budapest. Thank you so much for accepting our request, and we are really humbled to have you here, ma'am. And I suppose you're going to talk today about building public trust on science, am I right? Over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. A tiny correction, I am not a professor, but thank you for this promotion. It's my great pleasure to be here with you in these very unusual times. Of course, increasingly we have these types of interactions with researchers around the world. And in many ways, it's enabling. I can be with you, all of you, regardless of where you are. And I'm sure you're joining us from home, from offices, but doubtless from many different parts in India. So the idea is that I think I will talk to you for about 20 minutes. I thought that given the focus on this of this particular session and in general this week-long events, it would actually be better if I speak without slides, without any additional visual aids, and it will be quite informal. I will begin by talking about my own journey, how I became editor-in-chief of Nature, how my career changed. As you just explained, heard in the introduction, it was explained that I started my research career in Cambridge, and I trained as a geneticist. But how did I then transition to being an editor? And from that, I wanted to take you on a journey to think about your own careers, your own journey towards leadership, maybe now following leaders, but increasingly, hopefully, becoming leaders yourselves. And then transition after that to talking about our responsibility, collective responsibility, to promote and build public trust in science. And right now, in the time of the pandemic, there really isn't a better time that we could be considering the importance of public trust in science, but also the role that all of us, regardless of what we do on an individual basis, actually play in this endeavor. So let me start by talking a little bit about myself. So as I mentioned already, I started my career as a geneticist, and this was a passion which really started right at the very beginning when I was a school student. I was always interested in biology, but within biology, within life science itself, I was fascinated by genetics. And to me, genetics is not just the science of inheritance, but it's also a way of approaching problems in life sciences. It's a very interesting way of dissecting the complexities of life. And so, in fact, I studied genetics as an undergraduate degree in Nottingham in the UK. And after that, I moved to Cambridge to do my PhD at the MRC LMB, Laboratory for Molecular Biology. And of course, I was affiliated with Cambridge University. And at that time, I studied a classic problem in developmental genetics, sex determination, to be specific, on a classic model organism called C. elegans, a little simple worm, which many geneticists and developmental biologists have adopted as a model. And all the while I studied for my PhD, my goal was to be an academic researcher. Like so many PhD students, I dreamt of running my own lab, and I was thinking how I was going to study and what I was going to study throughout my career. And in fact, at the time, I thought that dissecting sex determination in different organisms would be something that I would want to devote my professional career to. It's a very interesting problem. If you're a geneticist or an evolutionary biologist, you will appreciate this already. Most characteristics, most traits evolve relatively slowly. So animals from different places on the phylogenetic tree are relatively similar in their characteristics, but sex determination evolves very fast. And I was really interested in why that was, and how this actually happened at the genetic mechanistic level. I then moved on to do a postdoc, which I did here in London. This was at what was then called ICRF, Imperial Cancer Research Fund Laboratories, now called CRUK. But it was during that time of my postdoc that I began to be dissatisfied with how focused I had to be in my research during a career, already these early stages of career. And it began to dawn on me that perhaps there were other things, other ways in which I could contribute to research. It was hard for me to leave some of the other topics that I was discovering and was interested in, and focus all my attention on the topic at hand that I was now researching for my postdoc. As I was coming towards the end of my postdoc, I began to think whether there was another way in which I could contribute to research, to the research community, to the research ecosystem, a way that is different from myself working in the lab, focusing my attention pretty much exclusively on one problem. There were just too many interesting things. And this was actually when I realized that perhaps scientific editing, a career as a scientific editor, was in fact something that I should consider. And needless to say, the rest is history. Just so that you know, there is no formal training if one wants to become a scientific editor. All is required is a broad interest in research. Obviously, first-hand research experience, because very clearly, when you work as a professional scientific editor, you need to understand how research is done, how research unfolds, and what it actually entails in order for you to appreciate what's been written up in a paper, what kind of advance it is, but also importantly, in evaluating if you request some revisions, working with the reviewers or by yourself, how realistic these revisions are. Is the work that you are asking for going to take 2 months or 7 years? What's realistic in light of the decision as an editor that you're going to make? But there is no formal training, there is no course, there's no preparation. So all of that training, if you like, happens on the job. So what happened in my particular case was that towards the end of my postdoc, I decided to try my luck. I applied for a position of associate editor on Nature Reviews Genetics, which is one of the journals published as part of the Nature Research portfolio. And this was my first entry into the world of scientific editing. I spent 7 years on the journal, relatively quickly becoming chief editor of the journal. And it was a fantastic opportunity to work with researchers on what I call big stories in genetics. So the Nature Reviews series of journals, as the name suggests, publishes review articles which are commissioned by the editors. So it's a very creative process. You work with the authors, trying to identify topics, trying to help the authors tell the story in a compelling way, in a balanced way, a way that provides appropriate background for the latest discoveries that they're trying to convey in a given review. And after about 7 years, I decided that I wanted to switch to working with primary research. And it was then that I moved to Nature itself. I was, for a number of years, in fact, 8 years, I was the genetics and genomics editor at Nature, where I handled many papers over that time in those disciplines. A fantastic time to be handling papers in these particular topics, a very vibrant discipline. Of course, if you think about genomics today, it essentially has become all pervasive throughout, pretty much throughout life sciences. It's become a tool for addressing so many different questions in life sciences themselves. Subsequently, I actually had a number of other roles within what was then Nature Publishing Group, but then I stepped away for a year, as it now turns out to be, stepped away from science publishing. I joined a research institute in the US, in Seattle, to be a director for science and science communication. And although that the focus of science communication in that role for me was very much on communicating science to the scientific community, it was an important opportunity to think about how science is communicated in a broader context, even broader context than I thought about as an editor in the two roles that I described. More recently, I returned to what is now Spring and Nature as editor-in-chief of Nature Communications, and now for the last 2 years, I have been editor-in-chief of Nature. So that's sort of my potted history, an abbreviated series of steps, how I transitioned from research, active research, to being an editor-in-chief of Nature today. And I think what probably is the most important message that I wanted to convey to you when I look back at my own example is that I would recommend that you are true to yourself and your own interests when you think about your career, when you think about pursuing your interests. And what's helpful to think about is how you can make the greatest contribution to others and to the advancement of science. And it may or may not be at the bench, or it may or may not be in a workshop, depending on what kind of research you do. It may or may not be in active research. If it is, it's wonderful. If it isn't, it's also wonderful. There are many different ways of contributing to supporting research and helping that transition of research and scientific discovery and their importance to the general public, something that I will move on to discussing in a minute. And I stress again, when I began to train on the academic path, the academic path was the only one I saw. I never considered myself, certainly when I was doing my PhD, I never considered that I would be doing, that I could be doing anything else later on in life. And as I continued in my research, as I met others who were engaged in science communication, in maybe research-related business, and many others, I began to understand that research ecosystem is a very rich ecosystem, and it, like any ecosystem, has many different niches in it. And the key, as I said, for me was being true to myself and my own interest, and crucially thinking how I can make a real contribution to this ecosystem. So if you're a mentor listening to me speaking now, I would very strongly encourage you to be supportive of your students and mentees in whatever they choose to pursue. Sometimes when I'm invited to give career talks and talk about my own career path, I'm invited as the speaker for an alternative career. And I would put it to you that if you look at the percentage of graduate students who go on to academic career, this percentage is so small, they are in the minority, that in fact, you could argue that the academic career is the alternative career and all the other paths are the major paths to follow. I am being slightly flippant here, of course, but I'm driving this point home to say, to appeal to you as mentors, or to you who are not mentors today, but who perhaps will grow into being mentors. Be supportive of your students and mentees in developing and honing skills that can be useful to others, skills that allow them to be happy and fulfilled in their career. And the other aspect of this is that being honest about your own motivation and your own actions will not only help you to have a fulfilling career, but it will actually enhance reputation of science as a whole. Let me give you an example, and I'm sort of transitioning now into this idea of trust in science within the public realm, but actually of trust in science within the scientific community itself. So what do I mean when I say that honesty in your own motivation and actions can enhance reputation of science as a whole? Let me give you an example from the research domain itself. And my example is to do with retractions. Most scientists, active scientists, dread retractions. As an editor, I have seen this over and over again. It's associated with a lot of stigma. And in many ways, I think our attitude to retractions of papers is unhelpful and wrong. And why do I say that? I say this because, of course, retractions, the umbrella term retraction, actually spans a number of different reasons for why a paper can be retracted. It can, of course, be that there has been some misconduct, there's been some wrongdoing, inappropriate behavior. In that case, retraction is absolutely appropriate. And this is indeed something to dread and clearly something to be avoided. As it happens, although willful scientific misconduct is much talked about, the reality is actually not that common. We talk about it because, of course, it's something we all want to avoid and rightly so want to be very critical of and intolerant of when it happens. But as I say, most of the time, it's actually, it occurs in minor cases. There are other types of retractions when, for unknown reasons, authors have lost their faith in the results as they are presented in a paper. And it is that honesty of coming forward to the journal and the editors in the first place, but most importantly to the scientific community, to say, we don't know what's happened. Maybe the data that were used or the aspects of analyses that were used are old and can no longer be gained access to, but so that others don't waste time trying to follow up on our results, we choose to retract a paper. This is a matter of honesty and transparency, which enhances trust in science, both crucially within the scientific community, the research community, but also outside of it. And then let me give you one other example, actually a recent example of a paper in Nature, which we retracted only to republish a paper subsequently. And so let me give you a little bit more insight into how this unfolded. But again, I love this example as an example of great transparency and honesty, which only increases trust in science. So the particular case happened because the group of authors who wrote the paper and submitted the paper, after the paper was published, realized that for this particular very complex modeling and analysis, they used a data set which in fact was inappropriate for this, to address this particular question. It's a very large data set, very complex set of analyses, and these authors and the collaborators had a number of similar data sets. And through an honest error, they used an incorrect data set in this particular case. They came forward, explained the situation. There was no alternative but retract the paper. But then they were subsequently able to return to the same analysis because the question was still important. It remained unanswered. They were able to return to this analysis now with the correct data set. This paper was submitted to us. It underwent rigorous peer review, just as if it had been a novel submission, and it ended up being published. So it was the same question, the same set of analyses, but now with an appropriate data set. So we have a case of a paper being retracted and republished now with appropriate data set because the question was still outstanding and it was of importance. So as you can see, first of all, I guess what I'm communicating with you is that from my perspective, the umbrella term of retraction is inappropriately generic. It actually hides a number of different types of events. And secondly, why it's so important to be honest and transparent about your motivation and your actions in science. And one final comment to make on this is rather an obvious one, and that's of course that science progresses through self-correction. We are continuously building on something that was published, discovered, described by others. We're able to extend this work because new circumstances come to light, because new technologies, new analyses come forward, and so on and so on. So science, therefore, you can think of it as science not being immutable. It doesn't stand still. It continues to evolve. And of course, that's why we all engage in it in our various ways and why we find it so fascinating. And I should say that today, in my current role, I do not consider myself a scientist per se, because I don't engage in active research. I am nevertheless part of the research community and the research ecosystem, and I feel very strongly that I make important contributions to it, and I have done throughout my editorial career. And so the reason why I feel that way is because through my work as an editor, perhaps now more so than in my previous editorial roles, I champion the work of researchers and its importance to the broadest, before the broadest audience, if you like. And so this makes me turn to this importance of building public trust in science. I spoke about transparency and honesty within the science community, within the research community itself, when I gave you an example of retractions, why that honesty and transparency is important. It's also incidentally important for building your own reputation within the research communities with your colleagues. But there's also this opportunity and responsibility vis-a-vis the general public. And so consider the time we live in now. We live in a pandemic which nobody alive today has seen the likes of. I imagine that probably those who lived through the 1918 pandemic are no longer with us. So for us, in our lifetime, regardless how old we are, this is going to be the most impactful experiment, if you like, that we live through. And if you consider during this time, science has been at the forefront of news reporting, whether it's in newspapers, on television, on radio, on social media, any other format of media, to the extent that it is not comparable with anything that I certainly have seen in my life. It's an amazing opportunity for all of us to continue to explain how science works. And this, what I said a second ago, the fact that science is not immutable is in fact crucial to the public's understanding of how scientific knowledge expands and grows. And it's absolutely crucial in the context of COVID-19. In every country has a slightly different way of engaging researchers with policymakers and politicians. We all watch these engagements unfold within our own country, but also on the global arena. And whatever the detail of how that engagement, how the interaction between scientists, policymakers, and politicians unfolds, whatever the details are, there is one thing that runs in common, and that is scientists work in a different way, draw conclusions in a different way from the way that policymakers do or politicians. And therein lies a potential bit of tension. We know that as researchers, we are careful to couch our conclusions in caveats. We always provide our conclusions in a given setting. We provide a background set of conditions in which a certain finding or a certain claim holds true. And we always are prepared and should be prepared to revise this conclusion should new information come to light. So consider this, what I just said, in the context of the pandemic, where every day, almost on the hour, new information comes to light. And scientists, researchers, clinicians need to revise their position. This is not something that sits very well with policymakers and politicians. And there's a famous saying that advisors, in this case, scientific advisors, advise, and ministers and decision makers decide. The saying is actually attributed to a former UK Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. There is a lot of truth to that statement. So scientists provide advice, and they should be allowed to do so on a continuous basis, but they should also explain how this advice that they provide, where it arises from, and why it may change. But of course, the decision in the end has to be made by the politicians and the policymakers. But there has to be a constant dialogue. And while most of us are not in a position to directly advise government ministers or policymakers, we are certainly in a privileged position to communicate to our surrounding, be it other members of the research community or members of the general public, how this process unfolds and why it is that when a scientist, a researcher changes their mind because new information has come to light, why it is that it doesn't mean that the scientific process is broken. It doesn't necessarily mean that the science is wrong. In fact, the very heart of doing science is staying open-minded, open to new findings, new conclusions, and being able to revise one's position at an appropriate time. This is a very important responsibility for all of us, so that the general public, who very fortunately is increasingly interested in science and the fruits of science, so that the general public understands how science is done, what drives it, and that it supports it, that it demands of its politicians and policymakers that increasing number of decisions are couched and based in scientific findings. So my final comment would be that whatever position you find yourselves in, whether you are a mentee, a mentor, a leader, a researcher, or in any other way engaged in the research ecosystem, we all have a responsibility to play, to fly the flag, if you like, in support of science and research more broadly, to engage with the public and capitalize on this fantastic enthusiasm that the public has for research today. I will stop here, and I will be delighted to take questions about anything that I talked about, or anything else for that matter that you would like to ask me about today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skipper. It's wonderful presentation, absolutely fascinating. You have actually spoke a lot of things about building public trust in science and publication process and what makes a good science, and the peer review process and and the current scenario in the COVID-19. Amazing talk. Thank you so much for being part of us, Dr. Skipper. I would like to introduce my the moderator, Dr. Mudrika Khandelwal. Dr. Mundriga is from, she's working as associate professor at Department of Material Science and Metallurgical Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Over to you, Dr. Mundriga.
Hi, thanks, Felix. Um, Magdalena, this was a fantastic talk. And I think we, as a researcher, we have this very, very important task of communicating to the public. But I want to bring attention of the people who are listening to the very first point you started out, is that trust in people. When you're advising students, let them go with what they are willing to do rather than, so just enable them. It's absolutely important to follow their passion. And I think that's a very, very key message, especially when today the world is evolving. I would like to take a few questions from people who have posted on the YouTube. And one of them is about the impact factor. So I'll just put a context a little bit. In most of the institutions, when you're shortlisting, impact factor, H index are used as a criteria to shortlist or get to the next level. As a person who has been working in science communication for so long, with your experience, how important, good, bad, your comments, views on that? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. It's a very important question. Impact factor is something, is a measure of, it's a measure that is pertinent to a journal, and it should never be used to evaluate an individual researcher. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but in fact, impact factor came to be misused. It was initially actually developed as a tool for librarians to decide which journals to subscribe to take out an institutional subscription to, which to renew, and so on. And as we all know, unfortunately, and I emphasize that word, unfortunately, it came to be used, or misused, I should say, to somehow evaluate a researcher by proxy. It is not a helpful measure. Let me give you a specific example. So I should also say that Springer Nature as a whole is now part of DORA, which is, DORA is an agreement. It's an acronym which stands for Declaration of Research Assessment, on Research Assessment. We no longer promote or publicize our impact factors. Of course, we receive impact factors. They are assigned and developed by an independent body, as of course you know, but we no longer promote them. And let me give you an example, Nature itself. So Nature, of course, is a multidisciplinary journal. It has an impact factor, like most journals. But what does this impact factor mean? Impact factor itself is a number which is effectively calculates a mean number of citations to a paper published in a journal. But Nature publishes papers across all disciplines in research, ranging from material sciences, particle physics, through to clinical trials and evolutionary ecology. How can you compare a paper in, let's say, evolutionary ecology with a paper in material sciences published in a journal with, an impact factor of X? It's a very unhelpful measure. I think increasingly, I'm very gratified to see that increasingly evaluation of applicants, evaluation of researchers is based more on the impact and influence of the individual papers they have published, rather than exactly where they published in terms of the impact factor of a paper. And increasingly, more and more institutes and universities actually ask researchers to select from their own publication list a small subset of publications that they feel have made the greatest contribution. And of course, the really interesting part of this type of evaluation is why an individual in a question feels that this particular publication is particularly impactful and particularly influential. I think that tells you quite a lot about the potential candidate. So I feel this is a very encouraging and promising direction that we're moving in when it comes to appointing researchers, hiring for new positions or promotion for that matter.
Okay, I'll pick up the next question. Apurva from Ahmednagar is asking, what is your take on alternative medicine like homeopathy and Ayurveda? Are these science, proto-science, or pseudoscience? Would nature consider papers on alternative medicine?
Thank you for this question. So I will answer this question from a scientific perspective. I'm certainly not a medical doctor. Nature is a scientific publication. As such, it considers submissions of manuscripts across all scientific disciplines that address questions using a scientific method. So there are examples of very successful treatments which have become mainstream treatments, which originated from traditional medicine. For example, some anti-malarial treatments very famously originated from traditional medicine treatment. But I emphasize that when we as editors consider manuscripts, we will consider a manuscript from the perspective of the question that it asks and how it goes about answering that question. It has to follow a scientific method, which of course involves a very transparent and clear set of approaches, appropriate methodologies, statistical significance, etc., etc.
Right. I'll go with the next question. So we have lots and lots of journals which come up where you publish what works. I would like to know what's your take on publishing what doesn't work, because that will save a lot of effort across the globe.
Yes, a very good question. A question which we collectively as a community have been grappling with for a long time. There is a criticism that we have a positive result bias, because indeed, as you say, what works, so positive results end up being published, but negative results do not. I agree completely. It's very important to publish negative results. Increasingly, we at Nature, but also other journals, publish negative results. They continue to be published less often. Nevertheless, the appreciation, indeed, as you say, of effectively abolishing a hypothesis, of showing that there is no effect of something on something else, and so on, is really important. It's also important, and it's not just a question of whether editors and journals are interested or not interested in this type of work. You may be aware that in the past, a number of journals specifically focusing on negative results have been launched. And these journals have not been terribly successful because researchers often themselves don't feel that it's time well spent to write up negative results or lack of a result and submit to a journal, because funders don't often reward this kind of research and these kinds of publications. So I think collectively as a community, with all the different stakeholders in the community, we have to work together towards this. I think there are some very positive signs to this end. One example that I will give is actually a relatively new, it's been around for a few years now, but it's a relatively new submission format called registered reports. A number of journals accept this type of format. Nature doesn't accept it yet, but I'm hopeful that at some point we will be able to accept it. Registered report essentially is a two-stage publication where you submit, if you like, a proposal of research with very carefully defined methodology and describing exactly what data you're going to use, sample sizes and so on, for consideration at a journal. This stage one, if you like, of registered report is then peer reviewed. The methodology is evaluated by the reviewers. And it's only at this point that researchers go ahead to carry out the research. And the stage two of registered report is published regardless of the outcome, regardless of the result. So this format, as long as the researchers have followed through the methodology that was approved by the reviewers. And so this format itself predisposes, or rather takes away the emphasis on the positive or negative outcome of a study, but shines the light and places the emphasis on the question and how that question was addressed. It'll go a long way towards redressing the balance, as you say, between the positive and negative results.
Okay, let me pick up two questions actually. It's quite related. For the first question is by Dr. Satyajit Ghosh from Diamond Harbour in Kolkata. How to get my paper published in Nature, even though my data is of high quality, statistically robust, and the discovery is substantial, I always get rejected from the Nature. And a related question by Rekha Kokanti saying, I noticed a general trend towards intercontinental consortia papers in Nature and Science, rather than 2 or 3 other papers. Any comments? Yeah.
Right. So, well, the first question is very difficult for me to answer, of course, because the decisions on individual papers are made in the context of a specific question, against the background in which this question is situated. Each paper submitted to Nature is evaluated by a professional editor whose research discipline is either directly relevant or very closely related to the question being asked. And each decision involves a discussion in the editorial office. So essentially, it's impossible to answer this particular question, but more broadly, I would say the thing which guides editors at Nature in terms of making a decision on a submission is how influential is a finding that a specific paper reports. How will it influence and change and enable the field in which the finding is situated, but also other fields more generally? So because Nature is not a specialist journal, but a multidisciplinary journal, there has to be an implication of the finding to the broader research community that goes beyond the immediate discipline in which the authors work. Now, the second question, you're going to have to remind me, I'm sorry, so that I answer is it precisely.
It's about consortia, intercontinental consortia.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So this is a very important observation. It's a trend which reflects a trend in research in general. Research has become much more data-driven in the sense of very large data sets. Of course, science has always been data-driven. But if you think back to the 20th century, let's say the middle of the 20th century, with the exception of a few disciplines, by and large, science unfolded in small groups of researchers working to solve a basic problem. Today, as our level of knowledge, the fundamental understanding of the universe around us and ourselves in it has grown very impressively. In order to answer some of the most burning questions that face us today, we need very large data sets, often data sets that come from different settings, collected maybe in different parts of the world, in different circumstances, but then that need to be analyzed by researchers that specialize in a number of different disciplines. It's that multidisciplinary approach, sometimes interdisciplinary approach, perhaps increasingly so, which is one of the most exciting aspects of research today. If you think about many questions associated with global health, sustainable future of this planet, many of them involve answers that will have to come from a number of different disciplines. If you think of a single paper that tries to tackle these issues, of course, necessarily these papers will be multi-author, and I'm talking now about not just 20 or 30, but maybe 100, maybe 200 authors. And often the centers of excellence will be in different parts of the world. And of course, that in itself is a beautiful thing, that science is a global endeavor, is a multidisciplinary endeavor, and a very collaborative endeavor. And the more we emphasize that, the more successful we will be in research. That said, we continue to publish papers in Nature which have very few authors, maybe one or two authors. They are certainly much less common than they used to be, let's say 150 years ago when Nature was first published. But we certainly see them in our pages even today.
Right. I think that was very nicely answered. I have one more question for you from Anil. He's asking, is there like fashion in published research? So like trending science that would get more easily published? Over to you.
Interesting question. And the answer depends slightly on what we consider as trending. For example, right now in the COVID-19 pandemic, you can imagine, you could describe, you could think of COVID-related papers and research as trending because it's a question of such utmost importance right across the globe. I mean, look what has happened. The world economy has come to a pretty much standstill, which will have long-lasting and profound consequences for all of us, regardless of where we are and what we do. So finding a solution, well, first of all, understanding the basic biology of this virus-host interaction, understanding why some individuals develop these very severe post-infection complications, how we can prevent that, how we can prevent infection in the first place, how we can treat, manage, how we can influence people's behavior so they, for example, follow the lockdown or social distancing rules, etc., etc. All of this has become at the forefront of everyone's attention for obvious reason. And we at Nature certainly prioritize papers associated with COVID-19 for all these and other reasons. So you could consider that as being a trend. And also researchers themselves, you know, I often talk to researchers now, of course, using these means or by email, or I hear from other exchanges that many researchers who previously have not worked on viruses or immune responses or technologies that could be used to track or detect immune response have redirected their labs to work on this because they feel they want to make a contribution. So in that sense, there are trends, there are emergencies which require immediate research response. And it's wonderful that this response is coming so rapidly and so willingly. In other sense, I suppose you could consider that there are certain, as new technologies and new analytical tools come to light, and it becomes obvious that these approaches now are much better and have superseded previous technologies, then the research which is done with these latest, using these latest approaches will be more appropriate and therefore will tend to be published more readily than questions addressed using previously existing technologies. So depending on how you understand what you really mean by trend, you could consider that there are trends. But I would say when thinking about it, I would think about it at many different levels.
Yeah, your example on COVID-19 begs another question here. Very interesting question, again, related one. Akhilesh from Port Blair says, fantastic talk, Dr. Skipper. You have touched upon retractions. In light of several high-profile retractions recently in New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, do you think the mad rush to get anything about COVID-19 is hurting the science? Or is pre-publication like bioRxiv cause more problems than help?
Very good question. So let me answer this question in general terms. First of all, a comment about preprints. I and we at Nature, and also more broadly at Springer Nature, are very supportive of preprints. In fact, as of last year, we encourage our authors to deposit a preprint when they submit a paper to us. We see preprints as being really complementary to what we do as editors and publishers on our journals. As you well know, preprints are hardly new. They've been around for more than 2 decades. In the physical sciences community has embraced preprints on archive for many, many years. And in those communities, preprints and traditional journal-based publishing have coexisted mutually to their benefit. In life sciences, bioRxiv is now several years old as well. In life sciences, it's a newer trend, but it's a very important trend. It's even newer in the medical sciences, in the medical and clinical sphere. And so medRxiv, for example, here, but also bioRxiv and of course others, have seen a huge upsurge of submissions, of deposition of preprints during the COVID-19 crisis. There is an interesting balance. Science and research always have to be done with care and due diligence. There's no question about it. But part and parcel of scientific training, that's why we all do. I mean, as I say, today I no longer do research, but certainly when I did research, I did it because I wanted to understand how the world works. And when I was communicating my discoveries, I wanted to have every confidence in those discoveries as I was sharing them with my colleagues and with the world. So care and due diligence and rigor in science and research are an absolute must. That lies at the very core, the very foundation. There are times when speed is important, and no better example than a pandemic. Right at the very beginning of the pandemic, we made an agreement, which we made publicly open, that we will, and this was actually a call that was put out by the Wellcome Trust here in the UK. Many publishers, many journals, funders and institutions also joined it. And the call was asking that those who publish in the COVID-19 related fields deposit preprints so that the findings are shared quickly with the research community, share data, and then they also inform WHO of these studies. So that's in fact what we do on behalf of our authors. We, with their permission, we inform WHO of these studies. WHO, of course, has unrivaled level of experience when it comes to dealing with epidemics and pandemics. It has great historic knowledge with how science feeding in at a time when responses have to be made pretty much in real time on the ground can be best filtered and implemented. So preprints and data sharing and speed at a time such as pandemic are important, but rigor must never be compromised. It's a real challenge and a lesson for us all as researchers, but also as journal editors. We too work very fast. We prioritize those submissions in COVID-19. We work with our reviewers to expedite review as much as possible, but we never compromise on rigor. So that's what I would say. I would say there has to be a balance. Speed is important, but rigor is of paramount importance.
So I'll pick the last question here from my side. Rajesh from Chennai is asking, as a biologist, what is your take on COVID-19 conspiracy theory that the virus is designed in lab?
There is, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence to support this theory. A number of publications have now been published in our pages, many different journals also, which very strongly support natural evolution of the virus and transmission through probably at least two animal hosts to the human. There are plenty of other examples of zoonotic diseases. Look at other coronaviruses, which transitioned from other animal hosts to humans in the past. And, you know, we have, throughout our history as a species, we have lived closely with other animals. Zoonotic diseases have been with us throughout our evolutionary history, and they're here to stay. We now know that this coronavirus is not going anywhere, will stay with us. It will of course continue to evolve. Remains to be seen in which direction, but it would be foolish to us to think that there won't be other examples of zoonotic diseases evolving. So there is a strange propensity for some humans to come up with indeed conspiracy theories. That was a very good term to use, but I have not seen any evidence to convincingly suggest anything else apart from evolution through in a sort of way that we've seen before with other zoonotic disease agents.
Before going, do you have any one-liner message to relate to the Indian women? Because this women in science is one of the theme of our the conference, this workshop, and you are a role model for, I would say, millions of Indian women on the top of the Nature magazine, and it's like once in 150 years. It's a remarkable achievement. Of course, you did it. So if you have any message, an inspiring word or two, because we have lots of viewers, and so any message to the viewers?
So I certainly hope I may be the first editor-in-chief of Nature who is female. I certainly hope I am not the last. I hope there are many more. And of course, I guess the message that I would give to women is to follow their desire and their dreams, not to be constrained by expectations of others, but to feel that they themselves need to be fulfilled. So believe in yourselves and communicate that belief to your mentors and those who should support you. And so now the message is to those who support women in science, create an environment in which women can flourish in science. We all know that diversity of outlooks and perspectives leads to better research, leads to better way of asking questions, better ways of addressing the question. So the more women we have in science, the more underrepresented groups of researchers we have in science, the better science we will have. So we all stand to benefit from it.
Thank you so much. Over to Mudrika.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one thing is quite evident with the way you have answered today. One thing you said, yes, we should all stay what we believe in, but I think at the same time, I'm really, we are grateful with your grounded approach to answer all the questions. I think that's what is the foundation about, if that makes sense, what I'm trying to say. It's absolutely important. And with that, I really extend a lot of gratitude from our side. Thanks a lot. And I hope we can see you as a role model in future, and also keep on, like you said, you are the first, but let one of us be the next, let's say. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. Over to you,
Thank you very
Felix.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye.